Hello my loves, and welcome back to either Our Lives in Horror or Strange Playgrounds. Now, the topic under discussion today is one I tend to avoid if possible. There is this phenomena it's not just in independent and small press genre fiction, it's in genre fiction in general. It just seems to recur again and again and again because there are no solid answers, as it were. But it's certainly in the ascendancy again now, where you have a sort of conflict between particular tastes within those genres. At the moment, it seems to be, certainly within independent horror fiction, it's revolving around necessity. It's really strange. The prescribed language that people tend to vomit up without really thinking about it when they engage with these debates and these arguments, specifically within horror fiction, and certainly it's also broaching into science fiction and fantasy as well. There's a discussion that's happening with regards to sex scenes primarily, although that has application for pretty much every other kind of visceral or sensualist scene or scenario in general. I mean, that's another funny thing. When people talk about sex scenes in particular, very often they're not. They're using that euphemistically. And even when they're not consciously doing it, they're referring to any scene which is designed to provoke a visceral response. And of course, it's peculiar in horror because horror is arguably a genre that is pervaded by those scenes and scenarios, and in subgenres it's comprised of them. That's kind of its purpose to a certain degree. It is designed to engage you on a visceral level. Interestingly, the same is true in romance. There are certain subsectors of romance that avoid sex and sexuality. I find that baffling myself. I mean, don't get me wrong, if that's what you want, if you like sort of desexualized romantic fiction, then fine, go for it. There is space for that. The problem occurs when it becomes a matter of position and of prescription, when people start to say, that sex scenes shouldn't exist or shouldn't occur. And it's often around this notion of necessity. They will say things, the anti-crowd, which I am directly opposed to, by the way, will say things like, why is it necessary? You get that horrible sort of wheedling non-position where it's, I don't mind sex scenes as long as they're necessary. I don't really understand what that means. And very often, I'll have to be honest, I don't think those who use that prescribed statement know what it means. I don't think they think about it. They've heard it and they think it sounds good. They think it gives them some sort of moral position or ascended position, when in fact it means fuck all. When you actually stop to analyze the language, when you look at it in Aurelian principles, what does it mean in and of itself? What are you saying when you say that? I don't mind a scene as long as it's necessary. Necessary to what? Necessary in what way? What do you mean? If it's engaging, if it's arousing, if it's doing something, even if it's only on the level of titillation, then it's necessary. It's doing something. It is performing a function. And even on those terms, I mean, I don't even agree with it. On those terms, I don't think that scenes of sex or of horror or of visceral arousal or disgust or engagement or whatever require justification. I'm of the rather hedonistic sort with regards to art in general, who believes that beauty is its own argument. It doesn't need any wider justification, and so is pleasure. It doesn't require anything else. Pleasure is its own reason and argument. You need nothing else. It doesn't need to occur in service to something. And it doesn't for my personal tastes, it doesn't bother me at all if there is a sex scene or if there is this or that, and even if it is a tangent or whatever, because it's real. That's what human beings do. I don't know whether you've noticed, but that's what human beings do. That's what we are in many, many respects. We that is how we engage. We're a bit like bonobos in that regard. We use sex in so many different ways and for so many different reasons. And not only that, but if they're good, if they're well written, then it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. It's part of the experience. It's part of the tapestry of human experience. I've never really understood this position, this non-position. I don't mind as long as it's necessary. With regards to what? Do you mean with regards to plot? Well, that depends on the type of fiction, doesn't it? Because there's a lot of fiction that's unplotted. I actually, personally, for my tastes, I prefer unplotted fiction. That's the way I write. I'm a pantser. I'm a total pantser. I don't plot my fiction, because it doesn't work if I do. I find it stultifying. I find it, and also impotent. I find it smothers the immediacy of the text. For me, this is just for me. There are people, there are writers who plot and they do it beautifully. And well plotted fiction is a joy. It can be really elegant and beautiful and well put together, but I don't do that. And on a level of personal taste, I prefer fiction that has that more immediate and visceral, and that I hate the term, but it does have application, organic qualities, where you can feel it evolving naturally based on what the characters do, how they respond, how they react to scenarios. That's the way I write. Usually my stories start with an image or with a sentence or with a concept, and they spiral out from there. I will get the initial seed of an idea based on something I see or imagine or hear or a train of thought or whatever, and it spirals out from there. There is very, very, very rarely, it has happened a couple of times, but it's very rare. There will very rarely be a structure to what I write, because that's how I prefer to do it. And in that regard, saying that certain scenes should only occur when they're necessary, it seems to be redundant to me. And also, it murders a certain visceral quality within fiction. Necessary to what? I mean, if it's in service to the plot, then that makes, if we're going for sex scenes specifically, it makes them perfunctory. It makes them, it seems to have this almost like, this underlying puritanism where the only reason sex can be referred to is if it serves a wider purpose, and that's ridiculous when you consider the nature of the vast majority of humanity. I mean, don't get me wrong, again, there are variations. Sex and sexuality it's a huge tapestry. It's this massive, massive arena of so many different identities and concepts and tastes and desires. But generally speaking, human beings engage with sex and sexuality on this incredibly visceral and necessary. In and of itself, it's necessary because it's part of who we are as an animal, as a species. It's part of who we are. It's part of what drives us. It's part of what defines us. So it already has purpose. It doesn't need this synthetic application. It can only legitimately occur if it serves plot or if it serves this wider poetry. No, it doesn't. It doesn't need to do that. By its very nature, it's already engaging, it's already profound and powerful, however it happens to turn out within the scene in question, because of its nature, because of what it is. And it speaks to something true in us. I've never really understood that. And you get the same arguments thrown at horror a lot as well. At other things within horror, people will say things like scenes of violence or scenes of mutilation or scenes of pain or whatever. And again, there are entire subgenres within horror that are made up of those concepts. They're made up of those images and subjects. To try and place some perfunctory parameter on them misses the point profoundly. And ultimately, as I say, it's a kind of it seems to be an enshrinement and imposition of taste. If you don't like it, don't read it. That really is it. If you don't like sex scenes, seek out stories that don't have sex scenes, you know? But don't try to prescribe to others the your particular parameters and this underlying or often unacknowledged puritanism. It does speak to something much wider in our cultures and in our histories and traditions, a much wider problem, which is we have been conditioned by literally centuries of, often, certainly in the West, sort of Abrahamic, often Christian prescriptions of morality with regards to sex. These traditions that try to demonize and disgrace us in our fundamental drives and identities. Sex in fiction and in all forms of media, for me, is a way of liberating that. It's a way of throwing off the shackles and the neuroses that have been cultivated over those centuries. And I do often find those who are sort of wagging their fingers and being didactic about it are operating from the unspoken or underlying assumptions of those traditions, even when, by the way, they don't positively identify with those traditions. They don't understand that they're doing it because they're so ingrained. They're so ingrained over many, 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 many centuries. Cultural enshrinement over generations. They have been inculcated into us to such a degree that very often we can't acknowledge them, we can't perceive them or understand when they are informing our perspectives and our judgments and our exclamations. And that's a problem. That's a real problem. Again, if you don't like them, don't read them. It really is that simple. Have research what you're reading, and if you don't like it, don't read it. For my money, as I've said, I think it's quite wonderful. I like erotic fiction. A lot of my fiction is either erotic in base or incorporates erotic elements, because I find the experience of eroticism tied up with so much else that I find fascinating about my own experience of reality and the general human experience of reality. It's this, and also that's another problem I have, the way that these judgments kind of compartmentalize sex and sexuality as though it's separate, as though it's something over here that can be put aside from, say, the metaphysical experience or the experience of our own bodies, of our own operation in reality. It can't. It absolutely can't, because it's fundamental. And I find that to be an error, to be a mistake. It's almost contrary to what I preconceive fiction and art to be for. If we're talking about things on a perfunctory level, I find that compartmentalizing sex and sexuality and trying to put it over there away from everything else is fundamentally flawed, because it informs so much of our human experience. It's why I personally, although, it is a matter of taste, and if it's what you like, it's what you like, but I don't understand romantic fiction that doesn't reference sex, at least in some way or to some degree. It feels synthetic to me. It feels puritanical. It feels like it's denying an entire arena of human experience that is tied up very keenly with that particular arena. I think it's inalienable, and I think it's inalienable to most arenas, to be honest. I mean, when we're talking with regards to horror, so much horror is about the erotic and it's about the dichotomy between, and the tension between the erotic and the thanatic, between sex and death, right? The erotic impulse, as the ancient Greeks understood, is the life. It's what compels us to run away from the serial killer, to be afraid. It's why so much of our fiction, certainly our popular fiction, it places sex and death very closely together. It's why the killers in slasher films so often are assailing horny teenagers, right? Because it is even when it doesn't realize it's doing it, it's kind of exploring that dichotomy between those two fundamental tensions within humanity. It's fascinating, and I think to compartmentalize it and to deny it is a profound error, if beyond any other consideration.